This is a long awaited session. We kind of paused here and now we're moving into the most holy. Last time we left with you at the separation veil,
Mm,
entering into the most holy.
place.
Are you ready to go in, Danny?
Of course.
All right. Now we need to set straight that there are two different types of veils, and we mentioned before that the outer court and walking into tabernacle, the veil was called masak, but the veil into the most holy was called paroket.
Mm,
And the Greek translation is also interesting. You see, there's masak and paroket. And in Greek, that paroket would be translated as katapetasma, something that rolls down. And that's why we translate not a curtain, but a veil. And the other one, epispastron, is something that could be pulled one direction and another. It could be covering things. So it's more operational veil, whereas kataparasma is a fixed boundary. Now, kataparasma is Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it would be used 6 times in the New Testament, 3 times in the Gospels, when they describe the veil that was torn top to bottom. And I find it interesting because, whatever pictures I look at, they want to show that, yes, it was that last veil, the veil into the most holy place that was torn down, signifying that that separation, that boundary is over.
hmm
It would become more interesting as this term also would be used in the book of Hebrews, but that's for the future sessions when we will ask the question, where did Jesus enter upon his ascension after the resurrection? So we'll leave that for later, but just wanted to signify that it's that last veil, paroket, that separates the daily functioning from that special place, the most holy. I put purposely the black and white picture because there's so many different versions of how that veil may have looked like.
hmm
Some put it more predominantly red, and in fact, most pictures I find are red. Some put it more purple. Now, when you look at the description in Exodus chapter 26, verse 31, it says, "You shall make a veil woven of blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and fine woven linen. And it shall be woven with an artistic design of cherubim."
hmm
And so it seems that there's these colors, blue, purple, and scarlet. And you shared something with me before about the blue. So please go ahead and share more.
Many of these colors, many of us read through the story of the Bible and don't notice when these colors come up significantly. One of them, I believe, is in Exodus 24, verse 10, where that's the 70 elders ascend the mountain with Moses, and they catch a glimpse of the feet of God. And it says that God was walking on clear pavement that was like sapphire. And there, if for those who may not know, sapphire is a blue stone. And so God here, the separation between the elders and the God of Israel is this color blue, this transparent blue. Additionally, this may have been foreshadowing the sea of glass in Revelation, which has colors mixed with fire. And so you have that red and you have that blue. And so these colors, the veil between our reality and God's presence, are always articulated with the colors of blue, with red, and of course the royal purple. And so that in part is something the Bible consistently shows. And so it wasn't just for decor, it was something showing that that is how the presence of God is seen in human eyes. I believe it's also reiterated in Ezekiel that what he sees is God walking on blue sapphire with glowing red feet, uh, so that you see that blue and red mix as well in the curtain.
Mhm.
So these colors of God's separation are always there, and it's there in the veil.
And we'll look more at the colors and the meaning of them when we look at about the beauty of the tabernacle. But right now, let's move at the object itself that was in there.
Mm,
Now, the room was quite large. In Moses' tabernacle, it was 10 by 10 by 10, a perfect cube. And in Solomon, it would be a bit larger, 15 by 15 by 15.
Mm.
And right in the center would be this small object. It wasn't large at all. Exodus 25:10 gives us exact size, 1.5 by 1.5 cubits
Mm-hmm.
and 2.5 cubits long. For those who read metric, we put it in this 75 centimeters and 1.3 meters long. So it's relatively small box.
But heavy.
Now, Benny, you probably seen Indiana Jones series, Raiders of the Lost Ark, right?
Yeah.
And Indiana Jones knows enough from Sunday school not to touch it.
Mm-hmm.
So they lifted on the poles.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting detail is they think it's some kind of energy box, supercharged, before Tesla invented batteries, that somehow the acacia wood and gold and the stone inside created this supercharge that if anyone touches, they would die.
Yeah, there's a lot of conspiracies about what it was designed to be. Yeah.
And it's all silly because we're looking at the spiritual meaning of this ark.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we're going to go. We're not touching about what happened to the ark. I believe we're going to record a whole session on should the third temple be built, and we'll be addressing the empty holy place, the most holy after Babylonian captivity, that there was no more ark.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the temple that Jesus would experience in his time, there was no more ark. But let's look at the meaning of this. In the book of Exodus, before God instructs how to build everything else, the very first item
It's the ark.
is just the ark.
Mm.
The ark of the testimony is introduced there in Exodus 25 from verse 10 and on. So it is the most important object that God would introduce at the very beginning. And that object consists of two items. There is a box, Aaron, and in English, there's a play in words, we say the ark. And so some people think Noah's ark or the little ark that Moses floated in the Nile. But in Hebrew, those are different words.
Mm-hmm.
Those are taba, and here is Aaron, which is literally a container.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps the best translation would be a container, a box that contains something special.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that container, there is a cover. And that word, kaforet, is a lid.
Mm-hmm.
Notice the root, kapar or kippur, Yom Kippur. And so
Atonement.
there's a connection with this lid. It's not just a lid, it's a cover. It's something that covers. And that is very significant, something we must understand about this cover. So the box and the cover.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the cover was solid gold, while the box was from acacia wood overlaid with gold, and even inside. So, inside matters. There is a symbolism there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the top that had to be from solid gold. And those two cherubims at the top were from the same piece of gold. So, they really had to be masterfully created. They're not attached to it.
And with this, one of my favorite things to do about biblical history is just to consider what it was like in reality. And the practical design of the ark says a lot about what it meant. Because the top would have been heavy for anyone that's ever held gold.
Mhm.
It's heavy. It's not going to be easy to move the cover off the ark. And it is also the most precious item of the sanctuary because it was pure gold. And so, if we were actually to evaluate which of the items was more precious or technically more important, it's the cover that went over the box that was the most detailed, the most invested in, and the most precious thing about the entirety of the sanctuary. And one of my favorite things to do when thinking about this, it wasn't built in a day. And since it was the first thing instructed, it was probably the first thing built, meaning that probably the Israelites saw it sitting there waiting for it to actually be dedicated into use. And I just like to think about that, the months that it was being built, passing by Hebrews, just seeing this precious item and thinking, what is this meant to be? It was probably wonderful when it was dedicated, and then the presence of God came down to fill with his cloud, and they actually see what it was.
Now, you mentioned the weight, and I did some calculations. Now, gold is very soft. So it had to be a certain thickness. If that lid would be just 1 inch thick, that would weigh 400 kilos.
Mhm.
Think of that. That's a lot of gold. It's super heavy. If it would be half an inch thick, it's about 200 kilos. Now, if you go thinner, quarter inch, gold would actually begin to suck because it's a soft
Yeah.
metal. You see, and you mentioned that yes, it would be the most precious because even menorah, the candlestick, was only 70 pounds. So
Mm.
this would be the most precious, heavy, weight-wise gold item, the cover.
And I know we could throw in here that many people may know this already, but the Hebrew word for glory is related to the Hebrew word for weight, kavod,
Kavod?
which
Yes.
to be weighty, to be heavy. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't be surprised if that's actually where that allusion comes from, is that the glory of God is contained on the heaviest item.
Right. And we're going to something very interesting here because this item, okay, this kaforet, is very significant. There's been a lot of misunderstanding about this kafaret. In fact, if you open your regular English translation, they translate this word as mercy seat.
Hmm.
Now, that tradition comes from Martin Luther and later on Tyndale, because Wycliffe did not use word mercy seat. He would simply leave the old Latin propitiatory,
Mm.
from which we get word propitiation, which not many people understand. But literally, it means a place of appeasement,
Hmm.
a place where peace is made. And this is where we get the idea at one meant atonement. But these are all invented words. That word, that heavy lid, was simply a cover that covers.
Hmm.
Right? Now, because it was translated as mercy seat, some associate with another seat. And I've heard people associating this word, kaforet, with Greek word bema.
Sure.
And yet that is totally incorrect. Bema is never used for kaforet.
Mm.
Bema is used as a platform. In fact, the word is used in Septuagint to translate any platform, kiur, Hebrew word. And platform means a judgment seat or a podium, elevated platform. For example, when Ezra and Nehemiah describe how reading would be done, they would go up on bema. When Solomon would go on a platform, it was bema in Greek. And the reason I'm focusing on this, Danny, because bema is also judgment seat of Christ.
Mm.
And so we have to be careful not to confuse the mercy seat, kafaret, with the judgment seat. So I'm emphasizing this. Kafaret is not the judgment seat, it is the covering. But because many people think of a seat, they portray the ark as some kind of throne. Many do portray it as some kind of a chair,
Hmm.
that this is the throne. And that's what this idea of mercy seat. Luther would translate Gnadenstuhl, which is the grace stool. Okay? But that concept of him dwelling between the cherubim indicates something more than just a seat. In fact, if we proceed further, another term is used, which is a footstool.
Mm.
For example, Psalmist said, "Let us go into his tabernacle, let us worship at his footstool." And many scholars suggest that that represented not so much the seat as the throne of God, but more a footstool, understanding that God's throne is much higher, much greater in the universe and not here on earth. For
Mm.
example, when Solomon builds the temple, this is how it's described: build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God. And the way Hebrew poetic language goes, this ark of the covenant is the footstool of our God.
Now, I would throw in here to make clear, even though it was a footstool, that doesn't diminish the presence of God at the ark. And the reason I
Of
say that
course.
is because a passage well known to me, Proverbs 25:17, make your foot rare in the house of your friend, lest he become fed up with you and hate you. And it's clear that in biblical symbolism, the foot was representative of your whole presence because it's what carries you places. That's why
Hmm.
in disputes, civil disputes, a woman would take the shoe and throw it at the man to, claim rights. And so this symbol that it was the footstool of God is more than just, a place where God rests his feet. It is a sign this is what carries
He's
his
present.
presence. And
Right.
that needs to be said that there's no diminishment with the symbolism of it as a
Right.
footstool.
And that's why God's Shekinah dwells above it, right? But here's an interesting detail. When Solomon would build the temple in the most holy, he would add two more cherubim.
Mm,
And those were huge, 10 cubits high. That's 15 feet high. And so these are kind of guardian bodyguards,
mm,
right? So it's representing that, yes, it is the footstool. And these large cherubims represent other cherubims that surrounding God's throne. This is just artist representation. We don't know how these creatures look like. We have no clue. But Solomon moving from the tabernacle of Moses to temple already indicates the greatness. That's why there was a cry. How could this temple contain the God of the universe, you see? And that's significant for us to understand. That kaphoret is translated as hilasterion.
mm.
And this is where English translators and Martin Luther, who translated German and he crafted German language, would use that idea of grace and mercy and seat.
Mm,
Because in Greek, hilas and terion, these two words, hilas is mercy,
mhm.
forgiveness, making peace. And terion is place. So the concept of the cover is a place when mercy is made.
Mm.
That's why it is the final altar, the third altar, where that blood would be applied on a day of atonement.
And,
This is the final place of reconciliation.
no, and I just want to agree with you there because many of us as Christians, and we've covered this in past lectures, always think of the altar of sacrifice as that's it. Everything was made right once a sacrifice is made. But as you study the sanctuary, you realize the altar of sacrifice was not the end of the service. As we covered, I think that was the first lecture. Sacrifice is just the beginning, and that the
Mhm.
actual being made right happens in the most holy place. That after the altar of sacrifice, after the altar of incense, the place where things are now reconciled and made right is at the very throne of God, in his presence in the most holy place. And so people
Now,
need to
this
know that. Yeah, yeah.
this Hilasterion business is where it gets even more interesting, because the very thing Paul uses to describe Christ's role is this word.
You lost that one.
In Romans chapter 3, verse 25, says this, speaking of Christ Jesus, right? Whom God set forth as hilasterion
For
by
us.
his blood. And this is where English translators struggle. New King James says propitiation. Other translations actually offer word sacrifice. No, no, no. Sacrifice is not made here. It's the cover. It's Jesus is the cover of the law. And that is incredible. That most glorious item, the heaviest, the most precious item, hilasterion in Greek. Paul would use that to describe the role of Jesus.
And this symbolism of what Jesus' role is, it's also his nature. That's why Paul could also say, in him was the fullness of what? The Godhead bodily, because where did God dwell? In on the hilasterion. And so Christ being that and being the place where reconciliation is made, being the reconciler, being the place where God's presence dwells. It's not just a passing remark. It's what the entire nature of Christ in the New Testament is
Mhm.
clearly pointing back to, that the most precious of the sanctuary, the place where all the universe is made right again, where God's presence literally dwells, is Christ, the
Christ.
Hilasterion.
Yes. Now, I'm going somewhere with this. We're still developing the thought. Because I remember one of my university professors telling us that Christ, being Hilasterion, is Bema, and alluding that this is the judgment seat. You see, that's why there's that connection of judgment and the most holy place and Day of Judgment, Yom Kippur, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying, no, Christ is not Bema. This is not emphasis on the judgment seat of Christ. Christ, being Hilasterion, is the cover, and there's a deeper meaning of it. Because, see, it's a mercy cover. It's a mercy that covers the law.
Mm.
And this is what we need to understand. This is the role of Christ, covering the law. Now, you may say, so what? Big deal. Well, let me take you to this psalm, and it's a beautiful psalm. This is a place where mercy and truth meet.
Mm-hmm.
This is a place where righteousness and peace kiss. You see,
Mm-hmm.
to me, this is powerful because law represents the truth, principles of God. And the cover represents that mercy which covers justice. Now, it not dismisses the justice. Justice is important. And that's why we must understand these things should not be separated. Yes, there is a truth and justice, but there is also this mercy of God covering the law.
Amen.
And even if people see it as the seat of God, the throne of God, then guess what? God is sitting on the law.
Mm.
For you to grab the law book and hit your neighbor with it, you have to chase God off the throne. You say, God, move on. I need to lift that. You see? And so I'm bringing to people's understanding that the heaviest, most glorious, most precious thing covers that law.
With this, Dad, as you're making these remarks about Christ, where mercy and truth and peace and righteousness come together, my mind is drawn to another psalm, Psalm 36, 7, where the word Hesed, or in the King James, loving kindness, says this: "How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings." And I love that passage because the shadow of his wings immediately makes us think of a mother hen covering her chicks. But one of the other allusions I have often heard of that metaphor in the biblical Hebrew is that is us being invited under the cherubim's wings, because those are where his presence dwelt, and so they are his wings. And so to be drawn by his love in kindness, by his steadfast love under the shadow of his wings, is to be drawn into his very presence. And I love that the place of protection, and that distinction needs to be made, at the mercy seat is not a place to be afraid of judgment. It's a place of the most clear protection. It's the place where you should feel safest on earth. And judgment has already been won for us by the blood of the Lamb. And so when we come under the shadow of his protection, it just should be nice to be there where mercy and truth and peace and righteousness all come together in that beautiful collaboration of redemption. And just as you were saying it, that's where my mind went, to that psalm of coming under the shadow of his wings, where we feel the most safe.
Amen. Here's the reason why I'm taking so much time about this mercy and law business, okay? It's very pertinent to our Adventist history. See, I grew up in Ukraine, and when you come to any Ukrainian church, guess what you see at the very front?
The law.
The law. And it started with our church being steeped in that law, from Rachel Oakes pointing out to the preacher saying, "You're not keeping all the commandments. What about the Sabbath?" Keeping the commandments became very important.
Mm-hmm.
This picture is James White pictured with the law of God, preaching the law. It was very significant to us. And in Ukraine, any church you turn to has the Ten Commandments on a display. Now, it is important. Ten Commandments reminding us the importance of the law of God. But this is another extreme to which we went in our history. You see, this is a picture designed in 1873 by Merritt Kellogg. He was the older half-brother of John Harvey and William Kellogg, famous Kellogg brothers. And this illustration was published in the Adventist Review. in 1873, May 27th issue. And so there was also a booklet published explaining the plan of salvation. And so you look at this, what is the central there?
The law.
The law. And where is it hanging on?
On the tree with the
The
all-seeing eye
tree
of
of
God.
life.
Yeah.
And so how are you saved? How do you receive life? The law, you see. And so James White later on would make some changes, remove that all-seeing eye and land the city from the clouds to the earth, but the tree still remains.
Mm.
Now, this illustration was called the way of life. It was revised and improved, and so it was available through review.
Remember one?
James White added in a booklet 3 years later in 1876 a bit more description of how God sees what we do and how we need to kind of work out our salvation, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some things removed. For example, the child and the animals representing the earth made new have been removed. But the biggest change would come shortly before James White's death.
Mm.
He discussed this with his wife, Ellen, and they agreed that changes need to be made. But it would not be until after his death that this would be published in 1883. See, James planned another version with these major changes. He wrote to Ellen, says the law tree needs to be removed. Christ on the cross needs to be made large and placed in the center. That reflected change in James White. Christ, not the law, is the center of the plan of salvation. You
Amen.
see, and so America's landscape artist Thomas Moran was commissioned to produce this steel plate engraving, and it was done.
Mm.
And so it's a beautiful picture that changes this perspective. It's not law that should be the center. See, many people focus on the law because it was in the box. No, no, no. It's the cover over the law that is the most precious item. And Christ is that hilasterion. He is that cover. And that's why after James' death, that engraving would be made. Now, later on, it would be another artist celebrating a centennial, Alfred Lee, would be commissioned by Ellen White Estate to produce a color painting, and it is displayed at the General Conference. And it's a beautiful image illustrating the importance of Christ for our salvation.
Mm.
But the reason it's important because it is part of our history. Ellen White would write this: as people, we have preached the law until we are as dry as the hills of Gilboa, that had neither dew nor rain. We must preach Christ in the law, and there will be sap and nourishment in the preaching that will be as food to the famishing flock of God. We must not trust in our own merits at all, but in the merits of Jesus. And you may say, so what's a big deal? Let me give you just one illustration. This is Review 1891. And the article by J.F. Ballinger is focused on justification by works. And so when you read it, there was big emphasis on keeping the law and our merits of law keeping. In the book that I mentioned before, and I'm picking up The Sanctuary by Richard Davidson, on page 214, he pens this incredible statement: only when we keep the law under the mercy seat can we see its proper function within righteousness by faith. That is deep. Righteousness by faith is Jesus
Mm.
providing atonement for us. Now he continues: to isolate the Decalogue or the law from the sanctuary opens the way for legalism, perfectionism, or defeatism. To maintain the mercy seat while ignoring the law leads to antinomianism. And so we're not dismissing the law, but we're pointing out that Christ covers the law. And that is important.
And with this slide that I see you bringing up, I want to interject. Being an Adventist since birth and for a few generations now, I know our modus operandi as a denomination is John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. That's why we've
Mhm.
always prioritized, the law, why we believe so firmly in keeping the fourth commandment. And I've heard so many Adventists quote that, misrealizing the priority in that statement. The priority is not keeping the commandments, which we should, mind you, that is exactly what Christ is saying. But the first order of business is what? If you love me, keeping of the commandments comes firstly from a love for Christ. And so if you
Mhm.
don't love Christ or know him enough to love him, then there's no point in even discussing yet the commandments. And so this is
Mhm.
where early in our faith we grew to understand Christ is central to salvation, Christ is central to the message, Christ is above the ark itself. And so first comes a love for Christ and then comes a faithfulness to what he has revealed to us.
Now, here's an interesting detail because when you look at the progression, you understand that the law of God should be not just in a box in a holy place, but in our heart. That is God's desire for us. And that's why prophet Jeremiah says this: Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. And so he describes what this new covenant is in verse 33. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. So for Christ to be enthroned in our lives, the law should be in our heart.
Amen.
Okay? And then Christ covers our life, covers us with his righteousness, with his presence.
Amen. And that, as you say that, this reminds me of a song that you played for us growing up by a Christian band, I think called Petra, which is "Take Me In," and I think the words are "Take me past the outer court, into the holy place. Take me past the brazen altar, Lord. I want to see your face. Take me past the crowds of people, the priests who sing your praise. I hunger and thirst for your righteousness, and it's only found one place. Take me in to the holy of holies. Take me in by the blood of the Lamb. Take me in to the holy of holies. Take the coal, cleanse my lips. Here I am. And that is still the desire of every true believer and the invitation for all those who claim Christ. Because I know you earlier cited it in Hebrews 10, where because we have such a great high priest, that we are now allowed past the curtain. We can now come into his presence. And I think it's Hebrews 10 where it also says it again, that the way you do that now, practically, is do not forsake the assembling one with another. That because we have a high priest who has brought us through that veil, we should assemble together. And so, if we want to be in His presence, we should be willing to come into the presence of one another. That's why the church is so important. Because I know this much: we will never get to see God if we are not willing to at least see His children week to week. Because there's no way we can say we love Him and hate one another. There's no way we'll enter His presence if we're not willing to even be in the presence of each other. And so that's the practical application of this, that we who are sinners are invited into the presence of God. We should be willing to go into the presence of each other.
I hope we made it clear in this presentation that the most important item in the whole temple service was this place where God makes final atonement, where truth and justice meet, where God's mercy covers the expectation he has from us, and he himself provides salvation.